All right, it's 9, so let's get started. We're going to talk about grouping and aggregating today. And um, what I'll say is you'll probably get this wrong a lot more than you'll get it right, at least to start. And I know I have, or I did, and I still get it wrong like a decent amount. But I think that with enough practice and enough um, kind of visualizing of like what's actually happening under the hood, you can get there. And so we'll do some diagramming today, and yeah, and we'll do some practice with grouping and aggregate functions. And so those are kind of like the things I want you to focus on today is a couple of things like what are aggregate functions and when do they appear, when and where do they appear in SQL, and then what do calculation methods return in ActiveRecord, and then what does the group by statement do in SQL, and then similarly what does the group statement do in ActiveRecord. And yeah, those are the focuses for today. All right, so let's see. Gonna share. Get out of the way. All right, cool. So yeah, we've got the learning goals, great. So I don't want to like go through all of the docs right now, but the docs for Postgres are linked here, and then specifically the docs for the Postgres aggregate functions that are available are here. Just so you know, kind of like where you could quickly get to them. They're here in this lesson, and yeah, they're worth like looking at. They're a little bit intimidating just because like they kind of look like an old website, but like they're still worth like getting used to, because a lot of it's like docs are just kind of all over the place in terms of like the layout and the styling. So it's always worth your time to spend a little time in the docs and see if you can kind of like take what's in the docs and not just like look at that, but then see if you can go like run a query based on that. Yeah. Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna start y'all off in some breakout groups, and I want y'all to work through this SQL aggregates so that like I'm not the one that's running these commands, but instead you all are running these commands. And what I want you to do is, and I'm gonna kind of like write this in the chat so you have it. I can find the chat. Yeah. Okay. So it'll be like work through SQL aggregates, run all commands, and explain in English what the command is doing. Cool. And once you kind of like run through all of the SQL aggregates, then run through the same ones in ActiveRecord. So you'll have to open up a Rails console this time. And those two things are different. Remember, Rails DB console gives you access to pure SQL in the Postgres database, and then Rails console is going to expect you to run ActiveRecord. All right, and we'll take like 10 minutes on this. I want you to get to this error message here and read through that, and then we'll come back for the grouping part. Okay. So, Nico, I see your question. If you run the commands that I put in the channel for this morning, then you should be all set with no more DB commands that you need to run. All right, let's do some breakout rooms. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna put you in these. We'll take like 10 minutes for this. if you have questions, feel free to ask. I put the what to do in the chat, but I'll also put it in the channel so it's available there. I'm going to thread it underneath.
It's already in the thread.
Okay, you got it. Cool. Thanks, Priya. All right, I'm going to open these. I'll see you back in 10. All right, cool. Looks like we've got everyone back. Any questions come up in those conversations? Anything about aggregate functions that y'all want to talk about? Yeah, Priya, go ahead.
We had kind of a, I don't know if it's off topic, but as we did the fourth SQL aggregate, select max length from songs, we noticed that it was just returning like just the max length. How would we update that SQL? We were trying to figure it out. It didn't quite succeed because then, like where conditions and aggregates aren't matching. How would you do it if you wanted to pull the whole record of the song with max length?
So you want to get the object back instead of the actual like integer.
Yes.
Gotcha. So that would require some more SQL, basically, where you would want to probably group by that and then order by it, and then once you've done that, then limit it to the top one. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think that's what our thinking was. Yeah, let's
There might be
order by.
a quicker way, but like that's how I would do it. If I was like, all right, I need the max length of the song, I want to order by, I want to group by the artist, and then I want to order by this like max length, and or I probably want to order by length in that case, and then limit it to one, because you don't want to order by max length, because max is always going to return that top one. Yeah, that's how I would approach it, but there probably is like an easier way that I'm not thinking of, to be honest. Yeah,
No, that's
Angela,
great.
go ahead.
Thank you.
So, for example, for that query, there are two songs that have the same length that is equal to the max. How do we how can we be aware of that when SQL is like returning something that might not be the only answer?
That's a great question. You could run your query in a way, like if we're thinking about it the same way, like you kind of have to know the limitations of the methods. Like, so you realize a limitation of max is it's going to pull one number back, but if you're thinking about like, oh, I want the actual resource back from this function, then you have to be able to kind of like think like, okay, like I'm gonna order these by song length, And then the next thing I'm going to do is check and see like, okay, do we have multiple records with the same song length that happens to also be the top song length? And at that point, you have to kind of like decide based on what you want to do with that data and what you want to show the user. If you're going to say like, oh, I'm going to show multiple records, or I'm going to limit it to just one. But like you're pointing it out, Max is going to limit it to one. So you would, if you wanted to show all of these, then you would need to once you got like all of the records in order, then you would look at that table and say like, okay, like I can see that there are multiple records here at the top. How do I want to grab those? And at that point, I'm not sure exactly what the active record is, but there's like a way that you can say like, okay, I want all of the top ones that are also equal in this column. And so, yeah, that's a good question. I would say like, how do you know is going to be a little harder to answer, but you know by doing deeper queries on your data. So you know by looking at it multiple ways, right? Like not just taking max as the ultimate truth, but understanding that like, yeah, there could be duplicates of this max value.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so I want to get into some of the lesson plan. So yeah, let's talk about this error. So the main thing to talk about with this error is that once you do one of these aggregate functions in ActiveRecord, and you do or you do like once you do the calculation, you can't do the rest of the query that you want. You'd have to set it up a different way. So this is kind of like where order matters, where you can't, once you run that .count, that's a calculation and it's going to spit back a value that's going to be generally an integer or a float. So just something to note there. And similarly, like how pluck works, pluck is going to give you like the array of actual values from that column, but you can't continue to run queries on that afterwards because now you have an array. Any questions on like this specific thing? Yeah, Danny, go ahead.
So basically what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're doing like our song.where, whatever, and then do the calculation at the end once we have kind of narrowed it down to what we want.
Yeah, so let's do that. Yep, so if I do a song dot and then this where play count greater than 10, then I do a dot count. Ooh, still don't get it. Oh,
So you
I
did
typed it wrong.
two
Sorry.
dots. Yeah.
Got double dots in here.
Yeah, my bad. Cool. So now we get this value back. We scoped it to 10. Let's scope it to like, I think that these all have pretty long song counts. Cool. Yeah. So this is kind of like how you can scope before you run the calculation, right? So you got to, if you want to scope it before, if you want to scope it to like, hey, I only want these play counts over a certain threshold, then you have to like put that in first. So remember that like the calculation method is generally going to either be last or it's going to be used in conjunction with a group by. Yeah, that's a good question. Anything else coming up? Priya, go ahead.
Hash had a good question in the chat, and I'm not sure if you answered or saw this. Aggregates return a single output value.
Correct. Cool. All right. This is gonna be some of me talking. So let's take a break and then we'll get into that. So let's take 5 and we'll come back at 30. All right, so it's 9:30. Let's come back together. All right, cool. So I'm gonna try and do this side by side with the lesson here. Cool. Cool. And let me get to set list. All right, cool. So I'm in my SQL console on the right, and then I've got the lesson plan on the left. So the outputs will be a little bit different than what's here in the lesson plan, but the actual like what's in the table is less important than what is actually happening via the grouping. So if we look here at our songs table, I kind of want to visualize it. So let's do a select all from songs. And okay, so we've got our songs table here, and we can see that it's slightly bigger than I want it to be, but that's all right. We can see it has an ID, title, length, play count, artist ID, and yeah, the created at and updates at. So actually, I just want ID, title, length, and play count. So give me just a second. I'll make those happen. Select title, length, play count, and artist ID from songs. Cool. That looks a little bit better. So this is kind of like what I want to focus on here. And we can see that we've got like a number of artist ID overlaps. And what we want to do here is we want to start grouping these based on a certain column that then SQL can combine records. And that's kind of like the idea of what the grouping is going to do. It's going to try and based on whatever aggregate function you give it, or based on a value such as an ID, it's going to attempt to group columns together, or group, I should say, sorry. It's going to try to group rows together and condense them. Generally, it's through a calculation, but we can also do it like a couple of different ways. So let me get, I want to get one more thing in this select on ID. Cool. So if I run a statement here where the first thing I do is group by artist ID. So I've got all of these, and then from songs, and then let's say I want to group by artist ID. Can't do it because I'm not doing it the same way that it is in the lesson. All right, so let's just get artist ID and let's group by that. So if I look at this, and what I really wanted to do is like kind of see the previous tables. Like this isn't that useful, but what I can say that it's doing is it's basically saying like, hey, all of you rows that have the same artist ID, we will now combine you into one row. So my artist IDs, if we look back up here, I've got up to 5. And what the group by statement does is it says, hey, all right, you have, looks like 10 different artist IDs. But since you told me to group by artist ID, I'm going to combine the rows that have the same artist ID. All right, so I'm going to take those rows and I'm going to smush them together based on this value. And so since I didn't give it an aggregate function here, it's basically just combining them into one. It's like, well, you didn't tell me if you want to like sum these or if you want to, get the average of these. You just told me artist ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to smush rows together based on the artist ID. All right. And so if you kind of like look at the lesson plan, the first thing that it returns here is all of my artist IDs, right? Because I said, hey, I want to select these artist IDs from my songs table. And then once I say I want to group with the artist IDs, now it's saying like, okay, I've got a kind of like a section with the ones, I've got a section with the twos, the threes, and so on. But then for each of these groups, now SQL does the smush, and it says, hey, if we got to figure out a way to like combine these rows. And so now anything that has a duplicate, which you can see, if I run it, anything that's a duplicate, which happens to be all of these, gets condensed into one. So this is the reason I'm doing this, is to show you what group by is trying to do. It's always going to try to do this. It's going to try and condense the rows based on some value that you tell it to condense them by. Kira, go ahead.
So potentially could group by be expensive in terms of the time it takes, and there might be something else that you could use, like if you have thousands of rows, that would take a while.
Totally. So this would be a more expensive calculation than, say, like we wanted to just do distinct rows. We're taking out like one step from that, because once it finds a specific value, so if I do this query here, select distinct, this is going to give me the same, essentially the same thing. If I can type artist ID from songs. So this essentially gives me the same thing, but I'm skipping the step of grouping them, and I'm just going straight to this step of like, hey, I just want unique values here, right? And so, yeah, this could potentially be expensive. However, I haven't seen a group by query. It's generally probably not going to be the grouping that's as expensive as the actual calculation. So whatever the aggregate function is will generally be slightly more expensive.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Yeah, of course. All right, Angela, go ahead.
So I'm trying to understand why you got that initial error when you had your one query. And like, I guess my guess is that you can only squish rows that are identical. Like, it didn't know how to put together like two songs with like different names into one row.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Let's get this back. So this kind of like leads to the next part of it. And I had everything in here. I had like artist ID, play count, all of these things. But let's just get it down to, yeah, let's just do it by title. And yeah, so now I've got, I'm selecting the title, I'm selecting the artist ID from songs, and I'm saying group by the artist ID. So when I run this, I get this error that says like, hey, like songs.title has to be in this group by clause or be used with an aggregate function. And it's basically saying like, hey, when you select a title, like I don't know how to group these things together unless you tell me how you want to group these strings together, right? Because once it's kind of like in the lesson, if we look at it, so we can think of this as like, hey, I've got my title, I've got my artist ID. It knows how to smush the artist ID, but it doesn't know how to smush the title. It's like, hey, I don't know what you want me to do with these two strings over here on the left because you haven't told me how to do it right. And if I don't know how to combine them, I'm going to tell you that. And that's like exactly why it wouldn't work with the first query I tried. It's because I had too many columns that it didn't know how to work with. Go ahead, Luke.
Like I'm having a Wayne's World moment. What is this artist IDs table? Like, what does this represent? What are these numbers?
Yep. So if I am looking at my query, right, I'm saying, hey, I want to grab the artist ID column from songs, and then I want to group by my artist ID. And once I say I want to group by this, it's saying, okay, that means we need to combine similar artist IDs and group by the artist ID, any artist IDs that are duplicates. Like I could have, 500 songs in here that had the artist ID of 1, I'd still get this table back because it's going to say, hey, I'm grouping by these, so I'm going to smush all of the rows that come back with this same value.
Okay, so these are still just artist IDs and just the artist IDs.
Just the artist IDs, yep, because that's all I asked for, right? I said I want just the artist IDs in my select from songs, and then I also want to group by artist IDs. So if I do a select artist ID from songs, now you see the duplicates, right? Because I didn't tell it to group by these. So I didn't say like, hey, this is like, these are the values that I want to smush together based on what my group by statement is. So if I just do the select, I get everything back. But if I'm grouping by a certain artist ID, then I'll only get one distinct value.
Why does it show up? Why do the numbers show up in the order that they do? Is that meaningless at this point?
That's a good question that I honestly don't know. Let's see if I can get back to here. I'm not sure why they're like this. I could get them to be different if I did an order by and then artist ID, I think. Yeah, so I can get them in order. I got to do it in order. I'm not sure how it's grouping them under the hood, to be honest. But clearly it's not grouping them in order. It's grouping them as, I don't know, as it's finding them and then spitting those values back. If I want it to be ordered, I can tell it to be ordered, but I have to be specific about that.
Maybe it's grouping them by the amount of times they're duplicated. So like song 3, I think is only appeared once. So it appears once, and then like song 1, I think is 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, so you know what? It probably, if I had to guess, this would be my guess, right? So we're grouping by artist ID. I'm guessing the first 2 songs, or maybe it could be the first song that it finds in my songs table has an artist ID of 3, right? Like that's what I am guessing, and I can check that I'll do it in my console to make it a little faster. Song dot find number 1 dot artist ID. I was wrong. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's not grouping them that way.
Can you do song dot first or something?
I don't know if I can do. I was assuming first would be my song ID of 1, and it is. Yeah. So I don't know how it's grouping them under the hood. If you wanted it's a good lesson though, right? Like if you wanted an order, tell it to be ordered. You know what I mean? Like that's why order by exists. Cool. Okay. So this is kind of like we'll turn it in. I want to look at this one more time. So the reason, if I do a select title from songs and then group by artist ID, I can't do this. It's the exact same error as if I tried to group by, or if I included artist ID in my select. So 2 things here. It's going to be the same. Like it's basically just saying like, hey, songs.title is not in its current form able to be mashed up in the way that you told me you wanted to group, in the way that you wanted to tell me that it should be mashed up. So if you get this error, which is you're probably gonna get it quite a lot, where it's like, hey, this certain column needs to appear in the group by clause or be used in an aggregate function. It's basically telling you like, hey, you have to calculate how you want these rows to be smushed on this column, right? Like it can do it for the artist ID, but it doesn't know how to smush a title string together. So this will work. This will give us my output from before, but it can't smush a string of titles. We have to do something with those strings, like count them, max them, something.
So do these only then work on like integers?
Yeah, so that's like generally our aggregate functions are gonna return an integer or a float, so some kind of like calculated value, and then from that point, then we can group on that, and that's like where, yeah, that, yes, long-winded, yes. Okay, so I want to do like one aggregating, and then I want y'all to try and diagram what's happening here. So let's do this statement that's on the left. So if I want to give it an aggregate function, I tell my select statement that, hey, I'm going to use an aggregate function here as like part of my statement. So if I say I want to select the artist ID and the average length from songs, and then group by artist ID. Cool. I'm going to show this. Cool. So it's basically now saying, hey, like, what did I have before? I had all of my unique artist IDs. Now that's still the first column returned because I told it to group on that column, but I'm also giving it an aggregate function saying like, hey, for all of these artist IDs, take the lengths of the rows you're smushing together and average them. Give me the average length for each of these artist IDs. And so this is what I get back. I get the average length, the average of all the length columns that were smushed together that share my artist ID. That's a lot of words. Talk to me. Talk it out if you need to.
Can you say that again, Tim?
Yep, absolutely. So how do I visualize this? So if I want to say, let's think about what was first returned. So I said select artist ID from songs. All right. Remember that this is the first thing that's going to be returned even when I do this statement where I'm saying like, hey, I want the artist ID and the average length from songs. And then once I say I want to group by artist ID, now it's taking every single artist ID. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now it's smushing them together, and it's also outputting the average length of the two songs that were returned for each artist ID. So it's taking those two songs, the lengths, spitting out the average. All right, and so I could probably see that, but I'm not gonna show it. But I assume that calculation is correct. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, you might have gone over this, maybe we haven't gotten there yet. But when we get to like the artist songs, when we group those by artist ID, does it put the songs into an array? Or how is it combining the songs, I guess? Like things that aren't calculations, like things that are like strings.
So you mean kind of like, are you talking about a joins? Because you said artist songs, or are you talking about
like I'm saying like, so the artist, so if we select artist ID, oh, I see what you're saying, because you're doing the average length. Oh, okay. I just didn't know if I think I'm getting confused with the song or with the joins table.
I think you're on the right track. So the reason that this won't work if I put in title is because it doesn't know how to group that, right? I didn't tell it how to do, like, it's like exactly what your question is. How does it know how to group these like songs? And it doesn't if I don't tell it how to. So the big thing that I added here was I added title in my select statement. All right, and so it doesn't know how to smush title together because those are still strings that it can't smush together. The way that this has to work is I'm saying like, hey, I have an artist ID and then average length. So now I put the aggregate function in my select statement, right? The aggregate function has to go in my select statement. And now I'm saying, hey, group these by artist ID, and artist ID is coming back and saying, all right, for every artist ID, all of my songs that share this artist ID, let's take the length column of all of them and let's average that length column.
And so we have to select the artist ID before we can average it.
So you could select the order that you select these in. I'm pretty sure doesn't matter. I could be wrong here, but average. The key takeaway is that whatever you're going to group by and your aggregate function both need to be in your select statement.
Okay, got it. That's what I was. Okay, that's what I was thinking. So if we didn't put, if you just did select average length from songs grouped by artist ID, that wouldn't work.
Correct, because I didn't put artist ID in my select statement. So this is going to be like, hey, artist ID needs to appear in your select statement. Oh.
Got it. So it'll still group it, but it's not going to show us the artist ID.
Yeah, so this is not the output that I expected, to be completely honest. It's just, yeah, so it's not showing you how it's doing the artist ID under the hood, and it's just doing that for you, which is interesting to me because I didn't select it. So what I'll say is, like, you need to have the aggregate function in your select statement, which is average length. But it looks like you can group by a column that is already an integer. So I would say that this probably will work for ID and for artist ID, but not for like anything that's not an ID. And this is why this is why we experiment, right? Like, I mean, the big difference from this statement here and the statement above was simply like, in the statement above, I specifically said, I want this artist ID back. In the statement below, I didn't select the artist ID, but I did group by it, right? I did group by it. So these averages still all match up with an artist ID. The difference is the table that I get back from this query doesn't include the artist ID as one of the columns. Yeah, thanks for that question, Alex. That led us down a good path, I think. Okay, let's talk about like what this does under the hood. And it's easier, I think, with the lesson plan examples, because that's why I kept them in there, is because the lesson plan only has artist IDs of 1, but I wanted you all to like work with some more raw data. So that's the reasoning behind that. But basically, when I say, hey, I want the artist ID and the length from songs, the first thing that happens is all of these come back, right? So the first part of this query is just the select and the from. And right now it's going to basically ignore songs. I don't know if this is going to run. Yeah, okay, so this averaged all of them from my songs. But if we think about what's happening here, the first thing that happens is it has to like say like, okay, like get me all the artist IDs and all their lengths. All right, so that's the first thing that's happening. So just imagine that the first thing happening under the hood is artist ID and length. Okay, so it has to get all of them. So this is what comes back first. All right, first thing I do is I say, hey, give me the artist ID, give me the length. Because I use the aggregate function of average, it gives my table a way to combine the lengths. All right, so it gives it a way to combine the lengths. When I do the group by artist ID and I smush these two columns together, or these two rows together, I get one ID back, which is 1, and then I get the average of 2301, which is 2301. But then they're smushed together. All right, and so I'm telling it how to smush this column together. But the first thing that I get back is all the artist IDs and all the lengths. All right, so if I go back here, yeah, I want this one. All right, so at first, it is ignoring my aggregate function. Once I tell it, hey, I want to group by artist ID, then it knows, oh, there must be a way for me to also combine the lengths. So at that point it says, oh, yep, there's my aggregate function, average length. So I'm going to group these by artist ID, and every time I smush those rows together, I'm going to take the average of whatever's in the length column.
Hey, Tim, I think Hash has a pretty good question.
Yeah,
Hash, do you
what's
want?
up, Hash?
Thank you. So is grouping basically used to like calculate, like calculate something for a set of data that's based off of a relationship?
Say that one more time. Sorry.
So is grouping used in? So grouping is used generally with aggregates, right? To calculate something that I guess that, and like in this case, is using a relationship with like artist ID and songs, right?
Yep.
So then you're usually you're using it to calculate all that specific information for that one artist, and then it's just smashing them into one row.
Yeah, and I want to say like two things. So the way that I'm like running through it, like I'm grouping on artist ID, you don't have to have a relationship between two tables to do grouping. Like you can still do some grouping just on like the ID, right? Like, or just on, or not the ID is a bad example, but you can still do some grouping limited to just one table. And I mean, realistically, I am limited to one table. These tables all just happen to have an artist ID. So the grouping and the aggregating I'm doing, it's still on one table and it's on songs, right? Like I'm saying select, and then part of my select statement right here is from songs. So I'm still just on one table. I'm just utilizing a column called artist ID to do my grouping. And so I don't have to have a relationship, but since I do, it's like a helpful column to group on.
Okay, I guess I just get a little bit confused with like the PG exercises we did in intermission when we started using grouping. Like it was using grouping of like different, and it's been a while, so I might be just getting confused. I need to run through it again, but like we were grouping by like facility names and things like that. But I think all of that was utilizing relationships between like members, bookings, and facilities. So I guess maybe that's where I thought that, but I could be confused just because I haven't messed with that in a while. So
yeah, and here's what I'll say is I think like it's worth revisiting after this lesson, right? Like look at some of those queries and see if you can talk out like, oh, based on what I know now, based on this grouping specifics, like what is happening here and how is it able to group in this specific way? And I think that would be like a good exercise for like kind of like clearing up that maybe not clearing it up, but at least like getting a little bit better understanding of whatever is foggy from the past, which like I would expect everything from that pre-work to be foggy at this point. So I think it could be worth going back though and seeing if you can kind of like solidify like what you did in those queries and like how they worked under the hood now, like having some more information on how group works.
I'll do that. Thank you.
Cool. All right, let's take a break and then we'll do some breakout rooms when we get back where you guys will have a chance to run through some of these. All right, it's 10:05, so let's get back together. Okay, so I'm gonna put y'all in great breakout groups, and what I want you to do is this is like the part of this that I want you to diagram. All right, so they're in the lesson plan. Let's see. We are on this count statement, and so I will put this statement in the chat. Okay, and so based on this statement, I want you to diagram what's happening at each point of the statement. All right, and so there's some helpful kind of like, visuals in the lesson plan, but it's going to be different from your diagram because you have different data. All right, and so I think that this will be helpful for you to take this statement and diagram what happens at each point. All right, and so basically this is counting the number of songs. So diagram each part of this statement. And what else else do I want to say? See if you can explain the parts of this statement as they happen, kind of like in English. So like, what do the columns look like at this point? When do they get smushed together? And how are they getting smushed together? All right. So questions on what I'm asking to do. All right, we'll take like 20 on this because I know we've got some Picassos, but some chicken scratchers, so that's okay. I think it's still going to be helpful to draw it all out. All right. All right. 20 minutes. Ask me for help if you need it. Yeah. Let's do it. Stop. Open. Okay, Grant, go ahead.
So my question was, when we were seeing two artist IDs and the examples, we're working through a join table and that's the handshake going on, right?
Yeah, but we actually didn't do any joining there. We kind of had the artist ID column already because it exists already on the songs table. So let me get to it. Sorry. Yeah. So artist ID already exists on my songs table. So I didn't actually have to do any joining yet. I already have artist ID, and I basically said like, hey, I want this artist ID because I know I want to group by it later. So I knew I wanted to group by the artist ID. So I wanted to get a column that has the artist ID on the left, and then I want the column of the count of all of my attributes for songs, which is basically going to boil down to counting each row.
Okay, so that was just the one-to-many already set up that we're utilizing.
Yeah, exactly. We've already got that column. It's already set up for us. It's part of our database, but we don't actually have to join in any of the artist data to do the specific grouping that we're doing here, which is based on the artist ID column, which is just already a part of songs because of, the previous kind of like relationship we set up.
All right, thanks.
Cool. Yeah, of course. What else came up in the groups? Anything that is interesting you want to share out or that you want to chat about? This participants. I have lost my participants panel. There it is. Okay, cool. Yeah, Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the actual the command made perfect sense. I understand what it's doing. I have no way of conceiving how to chart it out. I didn't really understand what you meant by chart it out.
That's all right. Yeah, that's okay. Here's the thing. If it's helpful for you to do the visualization, great. If it's not, then it's not like I'm check your charts. You know what I mean? So
right. Yeah. I'd be
here's what I'll
interested
say.
to see somebody's chart though, for sure.
Yep. There's something that came up in two of the breakout rooms that I was in. So I just want to run through this process first. All right. So we in our select statement, we select artist ID explicitly, right? And then we have this count all. So the first thing that happens is it groups all of our columns, which start with artist ID, and then it's ID and everything else. So title, length, play count, and then artist ID again, because we have basically called it twice. We called it once here, and then we called it again in this all statement. Okay, so it's going to show up twice. That's why this table is kind of like the first visual. Christopher, go ahead.
I can wait. I'd wait till you get to this explanation. It's a little off topic.
Okay. So now, since we've done that, the next thing that happens is our grouping. And so this is where I think some of the, because of the way SQL reads, it looks like the grouping happens last, but the grouping actually has to happen before the aggregating can happen. Before that count all can happen, the group has to happen. So basically it's saying, hey, I need you to group on artist ID, and it knows how to do that because we selected it explicitly in our statement here. All right. And so we're saying like, hey, I want y'all to take all of my artist IDs of 1, group those together, 2, 3, so on. All right. So yeah, there's a lot of like conflicting information here in the one, like, right? Like how are we going to put together length? How are we going to put together play count? And because our aggregate function says, hey, let's just count everything as an individual row, now it knows how to put all of that together, and it knows how to put that together because we've said like, hey, we're just going to count the rows from the tables that come back. And so the tables that come back from the grouping are right here, right? Like in yours, it's slightly different because there's 2 songs for each artist ID. But in this example, it's like, hey, everything's grouped together based on artist ID. And now let's just count how many rows are grouped together. Let's get a count of that. And then that kind of says like, okay, like there's 2 rows here for 1, 1 for 2, and 1 for 3. And then what we get back is our artist ID column and our count column. All right, before I go to Christopher, let's go, if you have questions on specifically that. Danny, did you have a question on specifically that?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of point out, like, if you scroll up to the original like select statement, like this just kind of set in for me. Like for me, if we look at that whole table that has like everything in it, artist ID, title, like all that, it's like select artist ID would be that very first portion, artist ID, and then you comma, and then the count and the songs group by and everything like that is the whole rest of that original songs table that is doing all of the things that we're wanting to do. And then if you scroll down further, it kind of goes into like, okay, we know that the ultimate thing we want to do is count, but in this little middle section is like what the group by part of that select statement is doing. And then the end result is the artist ID, and then all the shit that just took place. Like that's how I just visually saw it, having had you explain it. So like if I was going to diagram that, it would be your select statement with the artist ID, and then you comment, and then everything else over there in the other part of the table is the whole rest of that part of the select statement that's happening under the hood, kind of.
Yeah, so this is basically from select to songs gives us this first table. Then we group by the songs, which gives us these 3 individual groups, and then we count the rows, which gives us our counts for each artist ID. And then we kind of smash that data. We don't smash it. We output that data together as like, hey, you told me you wanted artist ID. You told me you wanted count. Those are the 2 columns that you wanted back. I had to do some work to get there, but now we're there. Okay, Christopher, go ahead.
So I was talking to Corey about this, and it makes sense right now. And when looking at it, the syntax and everything makes sense. But I was just thinking that it's very likely I'll end up forgetting the syntax and how to do this without reference material. And so curious about the expectations in like an interview or first day on the job or something like that, to have this all memorized or to be able to access it from memory.
Yeah, so I would say like no one's gonna expect you to like bust out pure SQL without a reference, and if they do, then that might not be the job for you. But like the idea is that you know how certain things work. So if they're like, hey, like I've got this table that has all of these columns, and I want an output of the length of all of my or I want the count of all my rows that pertain to a specific ID. You might be like, oh, I'd have to like select that row and then select everything else, and then I'd have to like group on my the column that you want the column that you want to have is kind of like my key. So that as long as you could talk through it, I think like you're in a good spot. So the expectation is not that you could write it without a syntax error from memory, but it would be that you could talk through. Like, oh yeah, and then if they threw in something like, oh, and I want it like, you know, in descending order, you'd be like, oh well, I have to do an order by, and then I have to like tell it, you know, this specific that you want it descending instead of ascending. So yeah, that's you need to be familiar, not perfect.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So I kind of want to keep going for like 20, and then we'll take like a longer break. Unless, let's vote on that actually. Break now, break later. Yes or no? No is break later. Yes is break now. All right, the no's have it, but if you need to take a break, then you can. All right, so I want to get into some active record now, and I'm gonna kind of show this. So what the query we just did in SQL, do I have it? Okay, it's here. I'm not gonna type it out. All right, so the query we just did, this count query, what ActiveRecord gives you and why ActiveRecord is great is it basically gives you the same kind of idea or the same thing, but it's going to give you back a data type that you can work with, all right? And it's going to be less lines of code. So if I want this to happen in ActiveRecord, I can go straight to a group, artist ID, and then I can tell it, hey, I'm grouping by these, and here's what you need to do. You need to count. My bad. All right, and so now I get what I like. If we think about this, this column, the columns, it's similar, right? Like I get a hash, and I want to show you side by side. Probably gonna have to do it. Yeah, I didn't run it. I'm just gonna copy and paste. Don't be mad at me. All right, so this is the same. Bear with me, it's gonna get better. All right, so this is essentially the same as the ActiveRecord query, which is here, right? These, and it comes back in the same order, like hashing doesn't matter for order, but you can see it's coming back with the ActiveRecord query the same way that it comes back with the SQL query, right? But the difference is my return value is, instead of a table that I can look at, it's a hash that I can work with, right? Like this is some data that now I know how to work with because I know how to work with hashes. All right, and so that's the big difference here, is that ActiveRecord is going to give you some Ruby objects back that now you can go and manipulate how you need to. All right. So you might be like, and this is also going to be, I can also kind of give it the aggregate function that I needed to do on the previous example, which is the average. And if I wanted to say like, okay, now I want the average length of songs, it's able to do that as well and give me back my hash with these with the key value pairs, the key being the artist ID, the value being the average length of all songs with that artist ID. All right, and so now I can work with this, and slightly confusing, right? I'm doing this group before I'm doing this aggregate function, where that is literally the opposite of how it has to work with SQL in the way that you write SQL. All right, so ActiveRecord, a little bit smarter, a little bit like abstracting away some of the selection that you need to do to get some of these things to work. But just know that, like, syntax wise, if something's like not working that you think should be working, try switching around which ones you're doing first, which ActiveRecord methods you're calling first, and a lot of times that's going to be helpful. Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if I missed it, but what is up with that like length, average length, like quantity, 0.39 E3? What is that?
Yeah, so this is like giving me let's see for real quick. I want to get let's get number 3.
You do .2i at the end of that to get it to be a solid or a whole number.
Yeah, so it's giving me an average, and I wonder why it's giving me that value like that. Let's see what this is. I'm gonna check and see what it is as far as like a class. I think it's like a big decimal. Yeah. Okay. So because I averaged it, it's giving me a big decimal back. But yeah, like Danny said, if I want to get this to like a value that I like, then I can call .2i on it or .2f. And now it's kind of like something that's a little bit better and a little bit more readable. Yeah, good question. That's something I totally brushed over and I wasn't even sure about, to be honest. But yeah, it's giving me a big decimal back because that's what the average method for ActiveRecord is going to return to you. Cool. Dan, go ahead.
So Rails has the big decimal. Would you be able to quickly just kind of best practices for using things in Rails, like zip codes, currency? Like, should we be using decimal or big decimal? Should we be using floats, integers? Do you have kind of an opinion on the most common things we'll see?
So anytime you have a big decimal, I would change it to like a float or an integer, just because those are going to be like easier to work with from that point. It's giving you the big decimal back because of the way that Postgres is giving it a value back, and it's the easiest way for ActiveRecord to deal with that is a big decimal. The easiest way for you to deal with that is not a big decimal. So I would convert it to either a float or an integer once you have that value.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Cool. All right. So just to show you like that this will not work the other way, if I do dot average length, I can't call a dot group statement on this average method that has already run, right? This is similar to how we kind of like started this lesson. Cool. All right, so now let's bring in some joining, all right? And so if I do like an artist, so now I'm starting on artist and I joins songs, isn't the easiest to see, but what is happening under the hood and what you can like reference in the lesson is basically I get a table with every single attribute for the artist and the song. Okay, so now I get a new table at this point that's like, hey, you've got the ID and the name for artist, plus you've got the ID, title, length, play count, and artist ID that all like match up with a specific artist. All right, so I'm getting multiple records back. So for each artist that has multiple songs, I get that artist and the name twice, right? So if you look at the example in the lesson plan, Talking Heads comes back twice because the joins table has 2 Talking Heads songs. So I need both ID1 for both of those songs in order to have a joined table, all right? So now if I want to, let's say I want to like do some grouping and some averaging based on my new table, right? Like now I have this joins table and now I want to do some new things with it. So if I look and I say, all right, I have this and I want to group on my artist ID, which happens to be the first column of my joins table. So I'm grouping on ID. And remember, the difference here is I started on artist. So the columns kind of like furthest to the left are the artist columns. So if I group on ID, it's going to take the first ID from left to right in that joins table. So it's going to take the artist ID. And then I say I want to do an average length. cool, this is very similar to what I got back when I started on songs. And I can see that if I look at number 3 and do a .2i, or if I give it the bracket 3 for the ID and then .2i. Cool, yeah, that's 390. So this is basically, what have I done here? This query, I started on song, right? And I basically ran a query to get to the same point as this query where I started on artist, but to do everything I needed to do, such as average the length, I had to join songs first because the length column exists on songs, not on artist. All right, so now I have this hash back, but if I want maybe, let's say like a ActiveRecord relation back, I can do that, right? So this is giving me a hash, but this is kind of like finally bridging this gap between SQL and ActiveRecord. If I know how to write some SQL in my selecting, then I can make this query a little bit more powerful because I don't have to be on a hash, but I can actually get all of my artist objects back instead. All right, and with this new column of the average length, so I can get a whole new table back that has an average length column. So that's like slightly more powerful in my opinion. So I'm going to keep most of this, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually give it a pure select statement. And what I want to give it here is some actual SQL. All right, and so I want everything from the artist table. So I'll do an artist.all. And I also want the average length, my aggregator, as part of my statement here. Cool, so I've got those two things. So I'm gonna get every single column back from artists, and then I'm gonna run an average length on my songs that are joined by my artists. And then I'm going to group by the artist ID, which I call ID here because remember in the artist table, it's just called ID. And now I can get rid of this aggregate because I'm putting it in my select statement. So different way to do it, right? And I'm going to get a different output here. I'm going to get a far different output. Oh, I forgot my quote. Okay, so at this point, I get an ActiveRecord relation back with all of these objects and this average length column. All right, so I get all of my artist objects, and notice that there's only 5 of them, right? Because I grouped on ID. So it smushed them together, and I get each artist grouped by ID. But you might say like, okay, like that's great. I'm not seeing an average length anywhere. I'm not seeing anything. And one thing I want to show you before I talk about the average length is the reason I'm getting the objects with all of the data is because I said, hey, I want all of the data. This all right here gives me every single column attached to an artist. If I wanted this to be different, I could do an artists.id. And now if we look at my output, quite different, right? I only got back the ID column. I didn't get all of the rest of the data because I didn't tell ActiveRecord to select this data. All right, so this is the difference between doing an artist.all with my aggregator and then only an artist ID, okay? One thing I also want to show you, you're probably going to run into this quite a bit. If I only select ID here in my SQL statement and I run this, I'm going to get an error. Ambiguous column error. Column reference ID is ambiguous because it exists on songs and it exists on artists. All right. So the way that I can get around this is within my SQL select statement. Like this is kind of like knowing how to do the pure SQL because this is exactly how it would look in the select statement in SQL. I have to say, hey, I'm saying select on artists.id. And then I'm also saying average the length. So the reason average length works and that I don't have to do average songs.length is because length only appears once on the songs column, whereas ID appears on both of them. All right, and this should still run. So I can be more explicit here and say songs.length. I don't have to because there's only one column called length. It's on my songs column. And this one is quite different, like how things are happening. Like the first thing that's happening is the joining, because we can't start selecting until we've joined the tables. So it's a little out of order of how things are happening under the hood, but something to note. What else? There's one more thing I wanted to show y'all. Oh, yeah. So you might be saying, hey, look, there's all these things back. You said that there was this average length column that was going to be returned, and there is. So I have a relation. I need to get on my artist object first. Or what I can do, what I think a better way to do this is we'll name it to a variable. We'll save it to a variable, artist with average song lengths, and I'll run that statement. So I have that, and now I can use my local variable if I want, which is just my relation, and I can say, okay, I want to see the first artist's average. How does it saved? It's called average song length. Average song length, and I get this value back. And so you might be thinking, huh, that's interesting. I didn't see an average song length with any of these objects that were returned. And indeed you didn't, but it is there. ActiveRecord, because you told it to query this average songs length, it actually by default creates a column called average song length based on this aggregate function. If I don't want it to be called average song length here, I need to rename it with an alias. Like, let's say I want it to be really short as AL. Cool. Now, if I save this, we'll just save this to artists this time so I can have it. So now if I save this, now I have artists.first, so get on the object. Now if I call AL, I can get that value back. All right. What's something you noticed here with this alias? Go ahead, Angela.
So I actually had a question from before, so I can ask it after if you want.
We can do it now.
So when you selected just the artist ID and we saw that like ActiveRecord relation, that was like cleaner than before because you didn't select all the attributes from artists. Yeah. Do those objects still have that information? Like if I go in and select first and then try to find it? It's like, or are they like special objects? Because I'm still thinking about them as, oh. Okay.
They're special objects. They're a special active relation that you created based on your query. And if I didn't tell it, like here, I only told it to select the ID and then give me the average song lengths. So guess what? It's only got, the only things that I can get access to are ID, average length, that's it. I don't have access to the rest of the columns. And so that is like, you could think of that as, that's what I want because performance-wise, I only need these two columns. Or if I go back to when it was artist.all, so if I have artist.all in my select statement, and then I group by the ID, and now I go .first, .name, now I can get my artist name back because I told it, hey, I want all of these columns, all right? And in my ActiveRecord relation that I got back, I have it in this one. I didn't have it in the previous one because I only told it to select the ID.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Absolutely, great question. Yeah, Philip, go ahead.
So you called average songs.length as a AL. Could you do that for like anything? Like, could you call the artist ID something else as well?
I believe, yes. You wouldn't, naming the artist ID something different isn't like a great use case, right? Because it's already called something like simple and not long to type. But like, yeah, you can alias anything you want, basically. Like, so if you do have a long column name that you're like, I want this as part of my query, like say I had like, you know, something that was like 3 or 4 words in a column name and I wanted to alias that so I could call it later, like you can do that. Yep. Yeah, and this AL could be whatever I want, right? Like this could be a length, like, and then I can do a dot first, dot a length. If I spell it right, I can do it. And I can get it back. So it's like whatever you want to alias it as. That's like very dynamic based on what you want here. Brett, go ahead.
Pretty much call like an active record calculation, and it makes a column, and then call it as an alias, which will make it like an attribute, so you can call it on the object.
Correct. Yeah, but you have to tell it in the select statement, hey, I'm basically creating this new column, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm naming it, where I don't have to do it that way. I want this one, yeah. I don't have to do it that way. I can do it this way, where I don't name it, but then I have to like look at the Active Record docs and figure out like what is Active Record naming this under the hood, which happens to be average song length based on how it's like figuring out how it's like, hey, what function did you do, or what aggregate function did you call?
Yeah.
On what table? On what column? And that's how you're going to get your method name that Active Record produces for you. So if I call that, the other good, I guess the good thing about using the method that Active Record is giving you by default is it's basically doing some work under the hood to get rid of those big decimals for you.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Sweet points.
Yeah, for sure. Danny, go ahead.
So would you want to like take a look at your schema table or whatever to see what columns it is that you would want to have access versus just calling like a dot all, like a select all or a select specific something, like just so that it saves you time from having to go through all that jumbling?
Kind of. So it kind of it's always going to depend on what you want. If you like want to be super specific and you know that like, hey, I only need one column on each of these objects that's returned in the relation. There's only one column I care about. Then yes, look at the schema, see what that column's called. Only select that column, which like in this case, I only selected the ID. But if you're not sure yet what you want to do, selecting all by default is totally valid, because then you're going to get all of it back in your relation, and now you can see on your objects like, hey, I've got the ID, I've got the name, I've got my created at, I've got my updated at, and under the hood you can't see it, but I've also got this new average song length method that Active Record created for me.
And how do you know that you have that?
You don't, unless you know. Like I tell you, Active Record tells you, you try to remember that. Anytime you're using an aggregate function here, Active Record is gonna, on the relation, because I selected it in this very specific SQL way, and I selected it with this aggregate function, that's why I get this relation back. And that's why Active Record adds this helper method for me under the hood. So yeah, you don't necessarily know that, and you can't even see it here, which I think is like kind of lame, to be honest. But let's see if I can, what's that thing? I think it's PP.
Is there any way to look up what it's named?
Yeah, based on the Active Record docs, but that's one more time, I'll kind of like show that. It's which aggregate function did you use, underscore, which table were you aggregating on, and then what column specifically on that table. And then it basically says like, oh, I can do that pretty simply. Like here's the function, here's the table, here's the column, and then that's your helper method.
So that average could even be something like distinct or anything like that.
Yeah, so like if we do, I don't think it would be distinct because that's not an aggregate function. If I did sum here, right, and then I change this to sum, it doesn't work. You hate to see it. I don't know what this is going to be then. Dot methods? Too many. Let's say dot columns. Dot column names. Let's see that. I know that there's a way you can get this. ActiveRecord relation C column names. I just looked this up the other day and I thought it was just column names. Says it's column names, but that only works. So column names works. It only works on a model though. So if I want column names, I can do this. Let's just make sure that this worked. So yeah. Okay, so it does work. I can sum the song's length. Gosh, I don't know what it is called. I thought it would be sum song length, but it's not. So let's table this and I'll figure this out. Cool. So let's take a break. Let's take like 10 minutes and come back at 11:16. All right, it's 11:16. So let's get back into it. So I just wanted to show you all first that I found the little thing on Stack Overflow I posted in the chat of like how you can figure out what the resource has as far as like a new method that ActiveRecord has added. And so what I had to do was I did a dot first to get onto one of my ActiveRecord relations, which would have been this like first artist ID, and then I called dot attributes, which shows that this sum attribute exists. Dot attributes returns you a hash of the column name and then the value for that column name, which is pretty nice helper. And so I indeed had sum. So what I could do then is do a first dot sum and I get this value. So it was, I guess with sum, they decided they weren't going to do aggregate function name table column. They're like, you know what, we'll just do sum. So it was kind of, I didn't know that. But look at that, figured it out. Cool, so let's pivot. Any questions on that before I pivot?
You have to call a dot first, or could you call like just like a dot attributes?
I think you have to call it, but I could be wrong. Yes, you have to get on the dot. What this returns is my ActiveRecord relation object, which is a lot like an array, right? But to see what each of those resources has as their method that I'm going to call, I have to like first get onto one. So get onto this object and then call attributes. Yeah. Yup. Priya, go ahead.
So if we did that artist.select blah, 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 sum, and then we call first.sum, what if right after that I did artist.select blah, 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 and then the sum was songs.playCount? Is it going to rewrite over that virtual attribute.sum? Like, so when I call .sum now, it's just going to be the sum of the whatever I said?
Yeah, so the sum is pointing to a value that is actually like whatever the sum of this, like whatever this aggregate function produced on that specific column. So it's like under the hood now you get this, you can't see it here, but just make sure I get it back. Cool, I got my relation, but now I'm summing play count. So now if I do a first and dot attributes, the name will still be sum, but the value is much different, right? It's not this, it's whatever the sum was of that play count column.
Cool, thanks.
For sure. Okay, pivot time. So, yeah, so resources. And this is like this helper syntax that I told some of you about, like, hey, we're hand rolling all these routes right now. I can look at my routes file here, and don't look at this. I can see like every route is like literally, hey, HTTP verb, what my URI is going to be, which action it should go to, right? All of these are hand rolled, but there is a way to clean that up and to to make it so that you can clean up your routes file, and you can make it so that you have all of the you have all of the REST resources that you need, or only some others. So let's start off with an example, and I'm going to kind of like skip through what the warm-up says to do because I want to do it my way. Exit, get rid of this. Cool. So now I'm back in set list, like just from the command line, and I can do a rake routes. This is something I remember doing hundreds of times, and it gives me all my routes, right? So this isn't that helpful though, because there's so many that I'm like, which one am I trying to look at, right? This is hard for y'all to even follow along with, right? Because there's all these like routes in there that we're not sure which one we want to focus on. So if I do a rake route and I know what resource that I want, I can say, hey, I want a specific resource, let's say artists. And now it's going to show me all of the routes that I have that include artists, right? So that's nice, really cool. Now I added a line here on line 5, and you can do this as well. You can call this whatever you want, and I actually will change it to dogs because I have a dog. So my resource is going to be dogs. And so now if I do a rake routes -c and then dogs, I want this to be just a little bit bigger. Cool. Now I'll just get the dogs, but you can see that just by saying resources dogs, I get all of these patterns basically out of the box by using this special keyword. So I get every single one of the 8 RESTful routes that I expect to have just out of the box if I use this keyword resources, right? So this is like pretty nice. This is a nice way when I know I'm like, oh, I'm going to add this, table to my database called dog, or called dogs, and then it's going to have a coexisting like dog model, and then I'm going to want to show all of these in my app. This is the way that you can go and say, hey, I want all of these routes here for my dog. And something else you can do, it's pretty cool. I can make this dog's route kind of exclusive and say only, and then I pass it an array of the actions that I want it to have. All right, so maybe I want only, I can't remember if these are strings or symbols, but let's go with string or symbols first. Only show an index for this route, so, or for this resource, right? Because like we have to think of like why it's called resources in the first place, and it's because like the like dogs is a resource, right? Like users is a resource. Like these are all resources that I'm storing in tables in my database. So it's saying, hey, you get all of your RESTful routes out of the box. But if I want to scope this to be like, hey, I actually, I don't want my routes file to get too congested. I only need a show and an index for dogs. Now, if I run this, now you can see that the routes that have been created are limited to the index and the show. And it kind of like hand rolls these by default. If I wanted this to only be, what else do I want to do? Update. Let's see what update does. I honestly don't know what's going to happen here. What I think I should get, since there are 2 updates, is I'm hoping I get both, right? I'm not sure if that's going to happen, so let's see. Great. Thank you, Rails. You're so nice. You love me. So if I update, we have to remember is the only one of these that's going to have 2, right? Because we have a put and we have a patch as our 2 HTTP verbs, and that's for like update this entire resource or update just a part of this resource. What else? Okay, yeah, so there's this other syntax that I want to show you called accept, and let's get rid of all of this. And I will say accept, and let's say I don't ever want to destroy a dog because that would be sad. So we don't need a destroy method. So now if I do a rake routes, now I get everything but my destroy as one of my routes. Another cool thing about this is these prefixes. When you have this prefix, this is basically giving you a helper method under the hood that the only thing you have to do is add path to it. So it would look like this. So since I have this prefix, I could call edit dog path, and then now that is referring to this path here. Okay. Now this one, edit dog path, wouldn't quite work this way. So let me show the one that will work. If I wanted to do new dog, this is going to go here every time. It's going to work every time. Or sorry, new dog path. That's what it looks like. So if I wanted this to be my helper, and you generally will use these in your views file when you need to like designate where something is going, like say like in a form for this one is where you would want this. So this new dog path would be something I could call wherever I wanted. Now, if I wanted to call something that had an ID as part of this URI that it expects, then what I'd have to do, let's go for the show. I'd have to give it an argument of whatever my ID is here. So this would be like a value, some value here. This is a better way to write it. Some value that I need to have in here. So if I wanted to go to the dog show path for the dog ID of 1, I would say dog path 1, and then it would know how to populate that. All right.
Hey, Ken.
Yeah, go ahead, Travis.
Quick question. I know that we're learning how to do this like in the controllers and models, but I'm just curious, can you limit what paths like an admin user or visitor can visit using the routes?
Yes, you can do that because you can do it as a nested resource in your routes. Yeah, and that's like part of this as well. So yeah, so yes, you can do that, but yeah, more to come soon. Other questions about like what I've kind of like been talking about here?
Does it matter where you put resources at in your paths? Would you want to put resources above like the section of routes that you wanted to resource?
It does not matter where you put them, but remember that the routes file reads top to bottom. So generally, like the routes file will be like, the way that it'll be laid out is root at the top, and then like the first resources that you created for your app, top to bottom, for like first resources down to like the most recent resources that you've created for your app. So like top to bottom, chronological order of like how you added things to your application. But that's like convention and not like it's gonna break kind of thing. Brett, go ahead.
So if you use resources, you don't have to list every single route?
Correct. Yep. And the reason we made y'all hand roll these, so you get used to the verbs, the paths, and the actions that they go to. This is still good to know, I promise, because you don't know what the company that you end up working at, like maybe they don't even have Rails, right? Maybe all of these verbs are part of their routes file in their other framework. So now you would know how to read that. Whereas if you've only used resources, you're going to be like, oh no, what is this? But now you know both. Yeah, Philip, go ahead.
Is it considered best practice to keep them cleaned up with your resources?
It is, yes. It's considered.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
My mentor showed me one of his routes files from like an actual like professional app, and it didn't use the resources. It had everything like hand rolled out.
Yep, and that routes file was probably pretty long.
Yeah, it was very long. Yeah.
And so that's where resources can like help you keep this clean, keep it shorter and easier to read. And like, here's the thing, like that company's not wrong, is what I want to say. They are just doing it differently, and they have decided, I would rather these routes all be handwritten, so it's very clear to developers that have not worked in Rails, right? You have to think there's probably developers coming into that company that haven't worked in Rails, and they're gonna be like, resources, like, what the hell is this? Like, everything's abstracted away. So they're probably like, let's just hand roll these. And now this other developer can, do a command F and find which route he wants to like look at. Yep. Cool. Corey, go ahead.
Kind of similar question in terms of best practices. Like if I just use resource dogs, for instance, and it does create a destroy route, but there's no target for that, is that considered poor, bad design?
Yeah. So if you did a resources dog, so you had a path to a destroy action, but then you didn't actually have it in the controller. So if I just hand roll this, but I'm only really using, let's look at what this returns. Yep. So if I get all these routes, but I only use, like index and create, then yeah, that's bad practice, because now I've got 6 routes that Rails is making under the hood. That all takes time. That's all performance related. That could confuse developers down the road, like seeing that like, oh, like, there is a route here, like when they do a Rake Routes, but then there's no action. That's just confusing. That's overhead that you don't want to create. You only want to create the routes that you've decided will have a controller action that you've set up with a corresponding view.
Got it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hash, go ahead.
Can you go back to your routes file or folder real quick?
Sure can.
So with using resources, obviously it hand rolls all the URI paths for you. But when you have something specific, like in your, where was it? Yeah, like sessions or users, where, it's like not users dot, ID or whatever, it's profile, you would just want to hand roll those instead, right?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Some of these, that's why you get both, because some of those you're going to want to customize, and some of them are going to be slightly different than what Rails is going to give you out of the box. And those are decisions that, like, yeah, you're going to have to make. Yeah. Good question, though. Christopher, go ahead.
Hey, so with what we're currently doing and being user story based, would you recommend writing them out, hand rolling them, and then going back and refactoring when we know exactly what it is we're going to be utilizing?
Yeah, so I would expect that. I think you can do it either way. I think you can hand roll them and then refactor at some point. Like, okay, like this is, I've done this get songs ID, but what this could actually be is instead I could like go back and refactor, and this could be a resources songs, and then only index and show, right? So that's nice. Like I can do it either way. And I'm gonna say, like, if you want to get practice like doing it this way first, that's not wrong. If you want to get practice doing it this way first and then refactoring here, that's not wrong. Either way is fine with me. Yeah. Cool. Go away. Who else? I saw one more. One more person. Oh, Adike, you put your hand down.
Yeah, it was Christopher's question.
Okay, cool. All right, sweet. So I want to give you all a chance to practice. Let's take one more break, and then we'll use the rest of the time to practice. And here's what I'll say: like, you can do nested resources with a do end, and I'm gonna not show that one. I'm gonna say like it's in the lesson plan. I encourage you to experiment with it, and it'll be part of the breakout group activity. All right, let's take a break. Come back at 40. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about the path helper one more time. So did I start the recording? Yes, okay. So if I look at my routes for artists, and I'm in the artist controller, by the way, over here on the right. So if I do a Rails-C artists, and then, what is it? No, that's not what it is. It's a Rake Routes artists. Rake Routes-C artists. Rake Routes-C artists. So I see that I get some of these path helpers, right? So if I wanted to use my path helpers, like a good example here is the create action here. So if I want to use my helper instead of this right here, like this path like here, I could also do, because I'm getting this prefix, this could be artist's path, right? And that's going to work out of the box because I have access to it. All right, so you can use this. This will be available in your controller and your view. All right, and it's related to this prefix here for each RESTful route. Each RESTful route, I should say, that gives you one of these prefixes. You don't get them by default. Or I'm sorry, you don't get all of them by default. You get some of them by default. All right, so we've got this routes file here. And for the rest of the time, let's go ahead and I want y'all to driver navigate this. And I want you to use resources wherever you can, but I don't want y'all to create extra routes that you don't use. And I want y'all to, talk about where you can use resources to refactor and where it's actually best to just hand roll a route. And I want you to try to tackle the nested resources portion. We've got like 17 minutes, so let's get it. And I will type this in the chat. Refactor routes.rb file in set list to use the resources syntax, and driver navigate this. And if you finish, then go through it again on the other person's screen or machine. Questions about what I'm asking?
How many minutes?
We're gonna use probably most of the rest of the time, so I'll come back and like wrap So we'll take 15 minutes on this. All right.
Looks like Chris might have a question. Oh, too late.
I think his hand was up from earlier, but thanks for letting me know.